begin by giving you a little bit of the history. This history, though, I think it would be very basic due to time. I think there's a lot more that we can certainly get into. But for today, I'll just get into some of the surface level basics. And I'll talk about how different forms of U.S. militarism has led to the current situation now, in which, as Charlotte mentioned, there is prospects or this potential for a hot war, one that involves nuclear weapons. And I'm sure you've all been seeing in the news, just how dangerous of a situation it is, and why peace at this moment is needed more so than ever. So I'll get into some of the basics of the U.S. intervention in Korea dating back to 1945. And then I will also talk about, part of the goal for me today is also to try to debunk some of the myths that exist in the U.S. public around U.S., North Korea, or DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the tensions that have been continually rising. The reason why I wanted to try to debunk some of those myths was to complicate the issue, that it's not as simple as the mainstream media puts it. It's not crazy, evil North Korean regime versus that's threatening to attack and destroy the benevolent, righteous South Korea that's being protected by the U.S. There's a lot more going on, and in fact, in our view, the U.S. has a lot of culpability in all this, in provoking the war tensions that exist today. So the three myths in particular that I wanted to get at are the following. So there's this notion, and Trump has been saying this a lot in the media, diplomacy will never work with North Korea. It never has worked. So that's one sort of myth that I would like to look more closely at. The second one is the fact that North Korea is the greatest threat to the region. I will talk more about this, but in some ways one could argue that the U.S. Could be an even greater threat to the region. And the third is that the U.S. military is there to protect its allies, whether it's South Korea, Japan, that the U.S. is there to protect the allies of the region from North Korea, China. So just getting to the really brief history, and I know that this is very crude, like a very crude version of the history, so if you, I hope that you can go deeper into it after this presentation. But so dating back to 1945, we all know World War II had ended, but around that time, in August of 1945, the Korean people, they also liberated themselves from the colonization by the Japanese Empire. And that was around the time the U.S. also dropped nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But following Japan's surrender, what's often not talked about is the fact that the U.S. arrived in Korea, as did Soviet Union, to divide the country into two pieces of land that they can occupy. The southern portion was occupied by the U.S., and the northern Soviet forces remained for a period of time. In the south, the U.S. established a military government, soon to be followed by decades of military dictatorships that were endorsed by the U.S. government. And one thing that I'll just quickly mention without getting too much into it is that there were efforts by Koreans on both sides since around 1945, in which the people who were invested in the independence movement, the leaders, they were also invested at that point in trying to carry out reunification for themselves that wouldn't rely on foreign forces particularly the U.S. But they weren't able to succeed because the U.S. was playing a huge role in sabotaging a lot of those movements for liberation and reunification. And I don't know if Joyakor will talk about this history at all, but moments like in 1948, the Jeju massacre, the Jeju uprising that led to a massacre, that a lot of that, there's a lot of evidence that point to the U.S. backing the South Korean police and military in causing all that violence. And just skipping ahead a little bit, 1950, I'm sure you all know the outbreak of the Korean War, June 25th. The fighting lasted around 3 years, and an armistice was agreed upon to put the war on pause, basically. The armistice agreement outlined a plan for the withdrawal of all foreign troops. Specifically, within 3 months, they were supposed to withdraw, and a peace process was to be established. But after 90 days, there was no process for a peace treaty. And although the Soviet and Chinese troops left North Korea eventually, the US forces remained, and still remain to this day. There are, I don't know if the figures are exact right now, there's 28,500 troops, US troops stationed in South Korea. There might be more actually in recent years. And despite this, the vestiges of war still present in the form of US troops and military assets in Korea, Americans still refer to the Korean War as the Forgotten War. Right, so why is that significant? In the minds of folks at Nodutor, the significance of the fact that it's referred to as the Forgotten War is it erases the history of total devastation and genocide that the U.S. military was in large part culpable for between 1950 and 1953. And because Americans have erased this history, political figures like Trump can easily say that the U.S. will bring total annihilation to North Korea and bring fire and fury like never seen before. But in fact, Koreans, especially North Koreans, have seen that fire and fury before. They've experienced that. It's a part of their memory. And it is part of their daily lives, in fact. And we know that 90% of North Korea was destroyed by the US carpet bombings. Many South Koreans were also affected by those bombings because many times the US indiscriminately bombed people during the war. And as a result, 4 million people died. And to just give you an idea in relation to other wars around that time, there were 635,000 tons of bombs dropped on North Korea, while there were not quite as much, still a lot, 503,000 tons in the Asia Pacific during World War II. So that gives you a perspective about the scale of the war, despite the fact that history remembers it as a forgotten war, or in some cases I've heard people say, it was like a police action, right? Just going into a little bit more of the history that beyond the Korean War, the media often talks about North Korea as the nuclear threat. But what we often don't mention is that historically, the U.S. was a nuclear threat in the region long before North Korea was. After the armistice, the U.S. for decades installed hundreds of nuclear weapons in the South, and the U.S. admitted to it, in fact, in 1991 when they had removed a lot of their nuclear assets. I think there are some that are actually still there, or they have returned. Most recently, the USS Ronald Reagan, which is a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier deployed over there as a show of force to North Korea, saying, we're ready to fight. But meanwhile, North Korea developed rapidly its economy and military, knowing that the threat of U.S. invasion was always imminent. And they did do nuclear research and development, but for them it was a way of deterrence, and it was a way to defend their sovereignty against the potential nuclear military attacks by the U.S. So now going into the three myths. The first myth being that diplomacy does not work with North Korea. I just want to give you one example of when talks between the U.S. and North Korea had the potential of working out. In 1985, North Korea agreed to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT. And the NPT essentially says that the 5 nuclear weapon states, which were the countries that already possessed nuclear weapons, when this treaty was first signed in 1968, so the US, United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia, that they will reduce their nuclear arsenal, and all other countries agree not to develop nuclear weapons. North Korea joined the NPT in 1985, and by joining the NPT, North Korea was required to be under the scrutiny of the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, and inspections by the IAEA led it to believe at some point that North Korea was developing plutonium nuclear reactors for the purposes of developing nuclear weapons. And so they were specifically looking at this power plant called Yongbyon power plant. And North Korea claimed, though, that they had this small 5 megawatt reactor in Yongbyon, and it was an experimental reactor that was meant for civilian purposes to generate energy and electricity. But the IAEA refused to believe North Korea, and they went to the UN so that the UN could condemn North Korea. And this was the beginning of the so-called nuclear crisis in Korea. And it eventually, because of the fact that the IAEA and the UN were condemning North Korea, not believing their intention behind these nuclear reactors, North Korea withdrew from the NPT. And in response to that, the Clinton administration, particularly William Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, and Ashton Carter, who was the former Defense Secretary during Obama, they were designated to develop a plan for preemptive strike on Yongbyon. But luckily, former President Jimmy Carter he kind of stepped up and went to Pyongyang without the consent of Clinton at the time, and met with the then leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung. And in a brief time, they were able to arrive at an agreement. So that's Carter and Kim Il-sung meeting. So they came up with this agreed framework of 1994, which stipulated that North Korea give up its nuclear reactor in Yongbyon. It would freeze the program, and they would re-enter the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and as well as allow continued inspection of any possible nuclear program. But in return, the U.S. would have to provide 2 light water reactors, which presumably had less likelihood of producing nuclear spent fuel, which is the fuel that's used for developing weapons, as well as the U.S. would provide oil reserves for a period of time so that it can cover for the fact that the North Korean people would lose electricity by closing the Yongbyon power plant. And possibly the most important part of the agreement was also that they would be talking towards normalizing relations between the U.S. and North Korea. The U.S., I think there were other moments that followed, such as North Korea sent one of its highest level military officers, Cho Myung-ro, to Washington. They met. They produced what was called the Joint Communique, which was a mutual agreement for no hostility between the two countries. And then shortly after, Madeleine Albright visited Pyongyang, visited then leader, the son of Kim Il-sung and the father of Kim Jong-un, who's the leader now, Kim Jong-il. And so it was building up to something. But unfortunately, this was also at a time when it was towards the end of Clinton's election, or term as president, and the election between Gore and Bush was happening, so it didn't quite reach the point that the people involved in were hoping that it would reach. So once Bush came into office, the agreed framework and all that basically became nullified. And especially the U.S., on the U.S. part, they didn't deliver on a lot of the deals that it made in the negotiation. Also, what the U.S. media doesn't talk about is the fact that North Korea and South Korea were, by 2000, in talks with each other about possibilities of reunification. There was a historic summit between the leaders of the two countries, Kim Dae-jung from South Korea, Kim Jong-il from North Korea, and that's the actual document of the statement that was released by the two countries, two states. And part of the significant part of that statement was that both the North and South sides would agree to resolve the question of reunification independently without the aid of the U.S. or any other foreign power, but through the joint efforts of the Korean people. And there were moments from 2000 to about 2000, early 2000s, where the North and South Korean people were actually coming together, talking about real possibilities for reunification. But the U.S., and as I was saying earlier, with the Clinton administration, it culminated into something, and then once Bush came in, the peace talks fell through. That happened on multiple occasions. Even in the Bush era, there were opportunities for peace talks, but when Obama came in, there wasn't any continuity that would be transferred over to the next administration. And a lot of times, and this is specifically referring to the Obama administration, the U.S. attitude towards North Korea was that we'll kind of keep them at bay and see what will happen. We'll pressure them with sanctions. We'll pressure them to freeze their program. But eventually, internally, North Korea will collapse. Well, all these decades later, North Korea has not collapsed. So this approach clearly is not working. The second myth I wanted to get into has to do with the fact that North Korea is the greatest threat to the Northeast Asian region. The U.S. holds the largest scale military exercises with South Korea, and sometimes with Japan as well. Largest, I think, in the world, and they do it multiple times a year. Most recently, they actually held drills off the coast of Busan, where, as I mentioned before, the USS Ronald Reagan, which is a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, as well as other strategic nuclear assets like the F-22, P-1B bombers, they were holding drills, rehearsing or simulating a preemptive strike against North Korea. There are two large-scale military exercises that are held every year, which are the Key Resolve Full Eagle and the Ochi Freedom Guardian. And those aren't really talked about in the U.S. media. So this is an image of I think P-1B bombers that are dropping dummy munitions. and that's the USS Ronald Reagan. During Obama's administration, the policy towards North Korea was strategic patience. And what that meant was that the U.S. would apply pressure through economic sanctions to isolate and deprive North Korea of nuclear or economic development, and then ratcheting up the pressure on the military side by holding those joint U.S.-South Korea exercises, which really simulated the invasion and what's called the decapitation of North Korea's leaders through surgical nuclear strikes. The third myth I wanted to get into was around this claim that the U.S. is there to protect South Korea and other allies in the region from any attack by North Korea. Currently, there are dozens of U.S. bases, and I think Joyak will actually talk more about bases in his presentation, so I'll kind of skim through a little bit. But there are dozens of U.S. bases in South Korea, and they have been responsible in many ways for causing different kinds of violence and destruction for locals in South Korea. One way is how they have displaced so many communities from their homes. And so I wanted to show you just a short video of a community of folks currently living in Gunsan, where there is a U.S. air base. And I'll just play the video for you.
미국 땅에 미국 땅, 군산 대행자가 미국 캘리포니아 주 표지역 캘리포니아주로 빼야 이러는 거야. 어디가 그 이주 지역에 이주에 가까운 차례야. 앞으로 3년 내에 거의 가까운 차례.
아, 위기도 환경도 얘기를 나오고.
그만큼 나눠서.
오케이.
그래서 지금 제일 남은 사람들은 아직 이제 못 간 사람들, 좀 남은 사람들이 못 간, 거기 들어서 못 간 사람들이고, 첫 번부터 간 사람들은 한 7, 8년 주면 이렇게 돼 있는 사람들이 나가는.
이 사람들은 가셔야 돼서, 고향에서 나가셔야 돼서 슬프지 않냐고 물어보시죠.
왜? 왜? 지금 왜? 학생들도 나가는데 왜? 여기는 지금 이렇게 보이면은 원래 어촌이었고, 지금 이분들이 지금 고향을 등질 수밖에 없는 상황이 된 것은 1986년도에 탄약고 안전거래라는 곳이 생겼어요. 2000년대 초반에, 정확히 모르겠는데 2000년대 초반에 그 공지를 했어요. 탄약고 안전거래라는 법이 있으니까 집을 다 비워야 된다라고. 사실은 사람들이 살고 있으니까 그 법이 있는데도 기재 안에다 탄약고를 만드는 것 자체가 굉장히 잘못된 행동이었는데 기재 안에서 마찬가지로 이어서 주민들이 해볼 수가 없었고 그런 부분들이 좀 나왔어요.
지금 이겨먹고 산 사람이라 국가에 원한 대로 오니까 방송대에서 내 쫓아버리는 게 좋은 거 같은데 쫓아버리고 그리고 뭐라고 이미 하는 하나의 수준이 한국 자연이 국가에서 대통령이 전부 명들이 가지고 그냥 치워버리는 게 처음에 그 아파트 우리가 전부 강제 쳐버리는 거지.
So that was actually some footage that was captured by a delegation of Veterans for Peace, and they were visiting last year, 2016, in the summer, different U.S. bases and taking a look at how the bases have affected the livelihood of surrounding communities. So clearly, the U.S. military base in this instance physically displaces people, and because it takes over the land of South Korea. Another way that the harm, another way the U.S. military bases have caused harm is through environmental damage. So this is an image of South Korean activists demanding that the United States forces Korea, the U.S. forces that are stationed in Korea, take responsibility for the oil spills that have come from the military bases.